What is the concern going forward here after what we've seen on this night?
Yeah, and the protests have really fluctuated a lot in size. Before the federal government sent in their forces at the beginning of July, the numbers were getting below 200 people that were protesting. And then the federal government came and the numbers grew up to thousands because there were just such outrage about the tactics the federal government brought. And the last few nights I've been here most of the week following the protests, and they've kind of come back down to about the 200, maybe a little more than 200 some nights people out, and police had largely kept them under control. They'd let them go out protest. Sometimes they'd light a fire or spray paint on buildings, and then the police would come in and make a bunch of arrests. And so it seemed to be sort of on a path towards something more calm and under control. Who knows tonight after something like this? I don't know where we're headed here.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello and welcome to our viewers in the United States and all around the world. I'm Michael Holmes. I want to get to some breaking news straight away coming into us from Portland, Oregon, where one person has been killed near a new round of protests. Police say they found a person who had been shot to death downtown. Now, this was near the scene where Trump supporters and counter-protesters had turned out, and there had been some earlier clashes that were reported between those groups, and there was a lot of social media video of those clashes. Now, what's not clear is if the shooting was related to the protests or not, or was some sort of separate incident. Police have not yet confirmed on that. Portland, of course, has become a flashpoint in the demonstrations over racial injustice. I want to bring in now our CNN security correspondent, Josh Campbell, for more on this. He's on the line from Los Angeles. Josh, what have you been hearing about what happened? There has been an awful lot of action in Portland over the last few hours.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. Obviously, this city has been the focus of so much attention in the United States for well over 2 months now. There have been these nightly clashes between protesters and law enforcement officers, both federal and local law enforcement officers. But today it started to take a bit of a different turn in that these protesters aren't just anti-law enforcement. What we actually saw, and is continuing as we speak right now, is there is also a large group of pro-Donald Trump protesters who are now also inserted into the mix. Earlier this afternoon, they had staged hundreds of Trump protesters outside of the city of Portland and indicated on social media that they were going to be heading downtown. And Portland police, in fact, put out an alert saying that there was this caravan that was heading downtown. They were asking people to please stay off the streets. And as that caravan arrived, they started clashing with demonstrators, police saying that they've made a number of arrests with these clashes between both the pro-Trump movement and also those who have been calling for federal law enforcement to leave the city, calling for racial justice. Now, it's worth pointing out that in the city of Portland, the overwhelming majority of protesters have been peaceful, but you do see those factions of violent protesters, and now just a very volatile, violent situation in the city of Portland where you have these two groups clashing. As you mentioned, there has been a report now of one death. Police are investigating that as a homicide. They say that they were in a downtown area. They heard gunshots, raced to the scene, and then found a victim who was deceased. As you mentioned, it's unclear whether this was involved, with the protest, whether this was one of the pro-Trump people, whether it was one of the counter-demonstrators, but it's already turned very deadly down there, and that continues under investigation. And this is just the scene that we've seen so much here in Portland, just this violence, but really taking a different turn now where you have this large group of pro-Trump people coming downtown. And the last thing I think it's also worth noting is that there was one of our colleagues from the New York Times downtown who's been posting video on social media. And in one instance, you actually see this caravan of pickup trucks come through downtown, and some counter-demonstrators were throwing objects at the truck. And in one instance, someone on the back of a pickup truck that had an American flag and a pro-Trump sign actually opens fire into the crowd with a paintball gun. This is obviously not a lethal weapon, but still very dangerous, can cause injuries. You see this person just firing indiscriminately into this crowd. Again, just a chaotic night shaping up in Portland now with already one person dead, and we don't know how long this will go. Police will try to clear out the area to get everyone back, and whether that will lead to more violence. Just a cycle that we've seen night after night in the city of Portland, Michael.
Yeah, that New York Times reporter was actually hit by one of those paintballs too. It was fairly dramatic video. These clashes, and this was an organised caravan of cars, by the way. They met up at a big shopping centre just outside the city and had a pre-arranged route through the city. There were dozens and dozens of vehicles. There's been local media video of those vehicles driving through. And as you say, the protesters on the streets were clashing with the vehicles as they drove through. You spent a lot of time in Portland covering these protests, Josh, and you know, President Trump has been slamming Portland's Democratic leaders and the protesters who caused damage night after night. But you know, I'm wondering, I mean, does this hurt his messaging now that, you know, there are videos of his own supporters driving around firing paintball pellets into a crowd?
Yeah, it would appear that the president, has no moral standing right now to describe what's happening in Portland as a one-sided scene of chaos and destruction. Again, that has been the case where there were, for weeks you had people that would stage at night and attack a federal building, throwing projectiles, trying to light it on fire. And that was the focus of the president's messaging. In fact, what he was trying to do is try to describe the entire city of Portland as under siege, which it wasn't. We're largely talking about one city block area downtown. But nevertheless, you have to remember we're in election year also, and the president has tried to portray his Democratic opponent as soft on crime. And the theme that we've seen from President Trump is, again, really going after these Democratic cities, including the city of Portland, saying that the elected leaders there, the Democrats, are unable to keep the peace, and really going after these protesters, calling them hoodlums and calling them thugs. But now you have his own people, his own supporters, at least according to this reporting tonight, coming in and clashing with demonstrators, again, shooting paintballs into the crowd. It really takes that messaging away from him. It's yet to be seen what will happen. I mean, we haven't heard the president come out tonight and condemn this kind of violence. We know that throughout, for well over 2 months now, since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which really set off a lot of these calls for racial justice and mostly peaceful protests, but you did have incidents of riot and looting. You've had the president, his own attorney general at the U.S. Justice Department trying to cast a lot of these protesters as far left, this far left movement, going after, for example, the group Antifa, and really trying to lay this on those who are left of center as engaged in violence in the United States. But here the video tells a different story tonight, where it's not just folks that are against the president, but you have his own people out there that are now clashing. But yet we have not heard tonight any indication from the president condemning the violence that's occurring there tonight. Unclear whether that will be taking place anytime soon.
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts. And we should emphasise to people, we don't know yet whether this death, this apparent homicide in Portland was related to the protests or not. It may have been, it may not have been. But regardless, while that's still unclear, the nation has been fixed on Kenosha, which is 2,000 miles away, I think, where those two people were killed. And a young man who was armed with a long weapon has been charged in that. I mean, just generally speaking, with your law enforcement chops, I mean, what does this say, this continued violence, say about the state of life in America right now?
Yeah, it is a very violent time right now in the United States of America, and there are a number of different reasons. We've reported on murders increasing in several U.S. cities. We've reported on aggravated assaults increasing in several U.S. cities. Now, there's a wide list of reasons why law enforcement experts think that is, everything from that has to do with the pandemic to other factors as well. But it's very clear that it's just a very toxic time and a very dangerous time. As you mentioned, one issue that has continued to garner a lot of attention is what took place there in Wisconsin following the police shooting of a black man. You had protests and then people coming out, one 17-year-old arrested and charged with the murder of 2 people. This person said that he was there trying to protect property He's been described by others as a vigilante, as someone who was coming out and essentially trying to pretend as though he was a law enforcement officer, and the details are still unclear about what took place exactly that night in Wisconsin. But one thing is clear is that this person is charged with the death of 2 people, and again, it's just a very toxic time where you've had people that are supportive of the president and Republicans and people right of center who've actually come to this guy's defense. He's actually amassed quite an amount of funding online that he's fundraised for his legal defense effort, people calling him essentially a hero. And so, just the overlay of this toxic time with an election year and obviously very polarized time, people in the United States right now can't even agree on security, on public safety. There seems to be a political angle to everything, again, now to include not only what happened in Wisconsin, but now we're seeing tonight in the city of Portland, where you have supporters of Donald Trump clashing with counter-demonstrators, and at least according to Portland police, it's turning very violent and making arrests. And again, as you mentioned, also 1 death tonight. We don't know if that's related. We're still working on that reporting, but just a very chaotic scene in the city of Portland, and it's a pattern, unfortunately, that we've seen in so many cities this year.
Absolutely. Josh Campbell, really appreciate you being on the line and filling us in. Just to update people, what we're hearing is from the Portland police have confirmed that they are investigating a homicide. It happened in downtown Portland, and this was after a shooting. It was a gunshot incident. The officers found the victim, a gunshot wound to the chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene by medical personnel when they arrived. Again, we don't know if it was related to protests that have been ongoing over the recent hours. I want to bring in now journalist Sergio Olmos. He's on the line. He's been on the ground in Portland. I don't know, can you shine any more light on what has been happening there tonight, Sergio?
Hey, thanks for having me. So this is the 93rd consecutive night of protests here in Portland, Oregon. Tonight there was a Trump caravan that started outside the city and came into the city. Hundreds of vehicles, thousands of people, and there was some fistfights in the street. And just now there was a man was shot, and OPB is pronouncing it a homicide.
Now, were you on the street when this caravan started? Because I've been seeing local news and social media video of it. It was an enormous caravan of cars gathered in I think it was a shopping centre just outside the city, and then paraded through the streets where, of course, there are protesters. And then the inevitable happened, and we've actually seen video of a man on the back of a truck with a blue Oregon for Trump flag firing paintball gun into the protesters, and what looked like pepper spray being sprayed from pickup trucks into the crowd. What did you see of that?
Yeah, so I was there at where it started in that mall. There was fistfights in the streets just on the freeway on-ramp coming into the city. There was fistfights in downtown when the caravan would have a long procession on the streets. Counter-protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, would stop their vehicles, put emergency lights on, and not let them go forward. And you can see videos that, I shot, others shot, of people, fist fighting in the streets. There's bear mace all over the place. And I'm standing right outside of a crime scene where a man was shot, and he's dead now. And this happened maybe 30 minutes ago.
What were the police doing at this time? I mean, a lot of the videos I saw of these clashes between the Trump supporters and the protesters, I didn't see any police.
Yeah, so when the caravan came into the city, the Trump supporters came into the city, there was fistfights, and immediately Portland police responded and diverted the Trump supporters back onto the freeway. And then, curiously, they let them back into downtown. And that's when things started devolving. When they came into downtown, that's when counter-protesters, Black Lives Matter supporters came out, and that's when you start seeing the fistfights, the up-close confrontations. Portland police did not declare this an unlawful assembly or a riot. We've had now 93 days of protests here, and they have been very quick to declare unlawful assembly when they see, crowds engage in what they call criminal activity. With this, what we see, it's just very curious, which is what we saw last Saturday, when conservatives came out to rally and fist fought with Black Lives Matter protesters is they didn't declare either of those riot or unlawful assembly. This is now the second time the Portland police have kind of avoided the clashes between left and right. But when the protest is against police headquarters or police precincts, we see very quickly unlawful assembly or a riot being declared.
Yeah, that is a good point, and those other clashes that you referred to last week, where Trump supporters were clashing with demonstrators, police were standing back, and it wasn't until the Trump supporters left that police moved in and then declared an unlawful assembly.
Yeah, just to jump in, they actually didn't declare an unlawful assembly. It was DHS, Department of Homeland Security,
right,
who declared an unlawful assembly because they came onto a federal park. Portland police didn't declare anything.
Right. Yeah. But they let them go at it until the Trump supporters left, and then, as you say, Homeland Security declared the unlawful assembly once the others had left, which was interesting. This event, I mean, what do you know about it? I mean, what I'm hearing, it was on Facebook. It was called a Trump 2020 cruise in Portland, and the route was actually posted on Facebook.
Yeah, that's everything you said is correct. And what you should know about the broader picture here is that, we've had 93 days of protests, of Black Lives Matter protests, but in the last few weeks, the kind of conservative right-wing and some elements of the extreme right-wing, like Proud Boys and that kind of thing, they've entered the arena. They want to have a say in the conversation, and they're holding their own events on the weekends now, and they're attending daytime rallies. The Black Lives Matter protests are largely at night. And so I think on day 93, what we see is that conservatives are now engaging in the same kind of like mass demonstrations that Black Lives Matter protesters have been doing.
What are your concerns? You've been observing this. I mean, that sounds like a bit of a recipe for disaster.
Well, look, I think what you see in Portland is not indicative just of the city, but probably of something happening throughout the country. You do have, we are in a semi-state of lockdown because of the pandemic. Schools are closed, lots of layoffs, high unemployment, and you see people taking to the streets for their social causes, and you see a lot of people, able to be out here. And the concern going forward is if we have these clashes and police continue to kind of avoid the area, what does that mean? Tonight a man has been shot. What does that mean tomorrow when one side, sees that on Facebook and tries to come out again? We don't know, but I'm telling you, it's day 93. Tomorrow's going to be day 94.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you've been there throughout. I mean, those you talk to, are they concerned that this is, if this does move into a new phase of not, Black Lives Matter protesters versus police or whatever, and it becomes Black Lives Matter or the left versus the right in a civilian sense, and let's face it, particularly in a country where so many people are armed, what are people in Portland telling you? I mean, initially we would always point out that the protests were around basically a city block or two. It wasn't the whole city, as the president was referring. Are there concerns that this could, really get out of hand?
Yeah. So, in terms of like whether this is a city under siege, it's definitely not. Like you said, it's a couple blocks in downtown where this is happening. I'm a few blocks away. There is a man who was shot just right outside here, but people are getting burritos right next to me. There's a drum circle, and people are just having a regular Saturday night here. That being said, these Black Lives Matter protests have been largely popular in the city. I mean, it is a very liberal city. That outside of Portland, though, it can get very rural and very conservative, and the protests have not been popular. And so one thing to note is, a lot of the people who drove into Portland, they started outside of Portland because some of them are not from Portland. They're from these surrounding areas. And so there is that dynamic of kind of rural versus city, right, liberal versus conservative. And also, the people of color here are saying, like, hey, these are mostly white guys who are coming in and saying, all lives matter. So there's multiple layers here, but there's definitely tension in the air.
Sergio, it's been great to get your thoughts, and please, if you will, just stay with us. Sergio almost on the line with us. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back. All right, welcome back. We're continuing to follow breaking news out of Portland, Oregon, where the police are saying that at least, one person has been killed in a shooting on Saturday evening there. The police are saying that the officers found a victim with a gunshot wound to the chest. Medical personnel arrived. They determined the victim was deceased. Now, what we don't know is if that is directly related to ongoing protests in Portland, and those protests have taken a decidedly ugly turn in the last few hours, after a Trump 2020 cruise rally in Portland was advertised on Facebook, and that led to dozens, perhaps hundreds of vehicles gathering just outside the city and then parading through the city. A lot of pickup trucks, a lot of people in the back of the pickup trucks. Protesters on the side of the road were challenging the Trump supporters. There were fist fights, there were arrests made, and there is video. New York Times reporter Mike Baker has posted online where you can see at least one occasion where a man in the back of a pickup truck with a Trump sign on the back fires paintball gun at rapid fire into the crowd. Other vehicles also in this parade, if you like, were spraying what looks like pepper spray, but we're told by Sergio Olmos in Portland is bear mace, spraying that into the protesters, the counter-protesters on the side of the road. A bit of an ugly turn. Let's talk to CNN law enforcement contributor Steve Moore. Steve, I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, I mean, when you have law enforcement stretched to the point that they can't keep two competing groups apart, this is what's going to happen. The defunding of the police, the backing down of enforcement leaves a vacuum, a law enforcement vacuum. And time again, we've learned that when law enforcement doesn't or isn't allowed to do their job, vigilantes will do it for them. So if you want vigilante justice, just continue to restrict the police and keep them from enforcing laws, because that's the reason police were created in the first place, is to stop citizens from enforcing the law themselves.
How does it complicate things for law enforcement? I mean, up until now, it has been, law enforcement versus protesters on one side, but now if this is a new development or a continuing development where you've got right versus left, that complicates things further from a law enforcement standpoint, does it not?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure in some ways it's a relief to them for the protesters to be throwing rocks at somebody besides the police. But at the same time, and not all protesters are doing that, but a significant number are doing it every night for the last 3 months. What we have here is, let's look at it in just pure pragmatic numbers. You don't have enough officers to maintain riot police every night for 90 days and still give people days off, allow them to sleep, to go home. They're running out of resources. Even if the Portland police or Portland City Council didn't put down some draconian rules on the police department, they still don't have enough resources. And so what's going to happen is that emboldens people on both sides. The people coming in on a daylight parade supporting their views, which is as legitimate as somebody at night supporting their views, they're going to conflict. And nobody's going to be there to stop them, and it emboldens both sides.
Steve Moore, really appreciate you taking the time. I want to go back to Sergio Olmos, who's on the line still and has been in Portland throughout, on the scene, on the streets. I was actually just looking at your Twitter feed, Sergio, and there's still a sizable crowd in the area outside the federal courthouse, something you posted about 45 minutes ago. What is the mood there on the street? Set the scene for us how it is now.
Well, right now they're outside the federal courthouse and they're chanting Black Lives Matter. And it's, when the person who was shot, when that news broke, nobody was sure who it was, and protesters thought it was one of them. As you said earlier with Mike Baker, New York Times is reporting that the man who was killed had a Patriot Prayer hat, which is a far right group here, the Trump side basically. And so tensions are real high because on social media they're talking about who killed this man, why did they kill him, and police are saying they're treating it as a homicide.
Yeah, indeed. Sergio Olmos, really valuable to have you there on the spot and your reporting, and we'll keep up with you on Twitter. So thanks very much, Sergio.
All right,
and we'll continue to monitor events in Portland, a very worrying development there. We'll be right back after the break.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie Allen at CNN Center in Atlanta. Our breaking news comes out of Portland, Oregon. One person has been shot and killed near the site of fierce and violent clashes among protesters. Police are calling it a homicide. But to be clear, we do not know if the killing is linked to the unrest. The shooting came after a huge caravan filled with supporters of U.S. President Trump rolled into town earlier Saturday, and it was met by furious counter-demonstrators. Let's go to Portland now. Mike Baker is a New York Times correspondent. He joins me from there. Mike, you were there during these clashes. What did you witness regarding the shooting that occurred, and do we have any information as of yet on the victim?
Yeah, so the shooting occurred while there were a bunch of pro-Trump vehicles driving through downtown. As you guys kind of covered there was a gathering out in the suburbs of Trump supporters, and they were going to drive around sort of the outskirts of the city. But a lot of them decided to come through into downtown where they met a bunch of protesters who were there wanting to confront them. And sort of during the hours of that happening, there were reports of gunfire, went over to the scene, and the police had blocked it off. There was a man who had been shot in the chest who was being treated at the time, and he appears to have been wearing a Patriot Prayer hat on his head. A Patriot Prayer is a far-right group here in the Portland area.
And tell us more about the clashes between these two groups, Mike, throughout this evening, and what was the police presence like during the situation? What did they do to try and help diffuse this back and forth between the Trump supporters and the protesters?
Yeah, I mean, as some of the supporters were coming and driving into the city, there were protesters that were blocking the street, and the police came and moved them off the street. And later on, as some of the protesters went down, some of the Trump supporters went downtown, some of the protesters were confronting them there. And again, the police kind of came in trying to redirect the crowd of the right-wing crowd to sort of keep the groups away. But at the same time, they're just driving all over downtown. You'd have trucks going up one street and down another in different directions, and protesters sort of going all different directions as well. So it became a bit of an unwieldy situation where there wasn't a central location where the clashes were happening.
And the protests, for the most part, have been isolated to a few blocks of Portland, as we understand it, and it's been 93 days. Tomorrow is day 94. What is the concern going forward here after what we've seen on this night?
Yeah, and the protests have really fluctuated a lot in size. Before the federal government sent in their forces at the beginning of July, the numbers were getting below 200 people that were protesting. And then the federal government came and the numbers grew up to thousands because there were just such outrage about the tactics the federal government brought. And the last few nights I've been here most of the week following the protests, and they've kind of come back down to about the 200, maybe a little more than 200 some nights people out, and police had largely kept them under control. They'd let them go out protest. Sometimes they'd light a fire or spray paint on buildings, and then the police would come in and make a bunch of arrests. And so it seemed to be sort of on a path towards something more calm and under control. Who knows tonight after something like this? I don't know where we're headed here.
Understood. And as I understand it, the Trump supporters, Portland is a very liberal city. Where did the Trump supporters come from? Did they come from areas outside of Portland? And do you know anything more about how they organized?
Yeah, there were plenty of people from sort of the region around Oregon, but also people who were driven in from other states. This was a group that had been organizing on Facebook for several days, sort of getting this event together. And so, yeah, there's a mix of sort of people, local people, and people from outside. And I think that's one other thing that's sort of just been inserted here a lot more the last week. A week ago there was a far-right demonstration in Portland that was sort of a chance for that group to say that they're going to be here and fight local protesters if need be, and that whole day turned to a volatile situation as well, where people were shooting paintball guns and fighting in the streets, and one person brandished a gun, and it had felt like a moment where it could be something deadly there as well, and here tonight it was.
A tragic scene for sure, and it's just so disturbing also just to think of Americans pitted against each other in the streets, fist fighting. Just a tragic scene all around. We really appreciate your reporting for us and your time. Mike Baker with the New York Times. Thanks, Mike. We will, of course, continue to track this story and bring you any more information about the death that occurred during these protests. Wisconsin is also the site of protest over racial justice and police reform. And after a black man was shot by a white police officer, the key swing state has become a political flashpoint. Chanting there, "You can't stop the revolution." The family of 29-year-old Jacob Blake led a diverse and peaceful march in Kenosha Saturday afternoon. Blake was shot 7 times in the back last Sunday and is paralyzed from the waist down. Kenosha has seen daily protests in the days since, including one where 2 people were killed allegedly by a right-wing teenager. U.S. President Trump plans to go to Kenosha Tuesday. The White House says he will meet with law enforcement and view damage from recent protests. White House correspondent Jeremy Diamond has more about his plans.
On the way back, as he landed here in Washington, the White House Deputy Press Secretary Judd Deere confirmed that the president will be going to Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday. They say that he will be surveying some of the damage from the fires there, as well as meeting with law enforcement officials on Tuesday. The president earlier in the day had suggested that this was a possibility, but it wasn't clear that plans were actually in action for this to happen. But now we know that the president will be going to Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday, and certainly this could be a very combustible situation. The president entering that situation, it's really hard to see how the president can help alleviate some of the tensions there. This is not a president who has chosen in the past to be that consoler-in-chief for this nation. This is a president who instead has seized on divisions happening in the country, including over this reckoning on racism and police brutality in this country over these last several months, seized on those divisions for his own political gain. And of course, the president has been seizing on some of the protests and some of the protests that have turned more violent into riots in parts of the country as he is trying to tout this law and order message as he tries to win re-election in the 2020 campaign. So certainly we'll have to see how the president handles this very, very delicate visit on Tuesday. And as of now, again, there are no plans for the president to meet with Jacob Blake or the family of Jacob Blake. We'll have to wait and see whether something on that front does develop. But as of now, no plans for that.
Our Sarah Seidner spoke with Blake's father Saturday on the sidelines of that march in Kenosha. Here's her report on that, plus the latest on the investigation into the shooting in Wisconsin.
Here in Kenosha, there was about 2,000 people who came out in support of Jacob Blake and Jacob Blake's family. His family leading a protest here in Kenosha, several blocks that ended up at the courthouse where they then spoke. We heard from Jacob Blake's uncle, Justin Blake. We heard from Jacob Blake's sister. We heard from Jacob Blake's father as well, all speaking about a couple of things. One, asking for peaceful protests, but two, telling people that they must vote, that is the next thing after protesting in the streets. We also talked to Jacob Blake's father about what happened in this case and what he sees should happen going forward after the police association here in Kenosha made allegations against Jacob Blake that he was armed, that he was fighting with the police, that he had a police officer in a headlock and had to be tased. His father reacting, saying what he sees certainly did not prove an imminent threat to the officer who ended up shooting him in the back 7 times.
How can you be in imminent danger when a person has nothing in their hands? What was he, Superman? He could see the knife through the walls of the car? The police union means nothing to me. It's a bunch of cats that pay a bunch of dues to have a title, a union. They do nothing but support their bad cops. He's a bad cop. It didn't take 7 shots to find out that. The first shot told you that the second one was coming. The third shot told you that the fourth one, he's trying to kill him. The 5th shot said, damn, man, how many more times you gonna shoot? By the time the 7th shot got there, it's attempted murder.
But no officer at this point has been charged in this case. We do know that, of course, there is an investigation underway. The State Department of Justice is investigating and saying that they are going to be doing an impartial investigation and that the police association does not speak for anyone other than the defense of the officers. They are very adamant and clear in that they are the investigating agency in this case. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Kenosha.
Joining me now in Los Angeles, CNN legal analyst Ariva Martin. Ariva, thank you for coming on.
Absolutely, Natalie.
Well, President Trump is going to Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday to meet with law enforcement and to survey some of the damage from recent protests. What do you expect to hear from the president on this trip?
I think we're going to hear more of his law and order message. He's made it pretty clear, Natalie, that for him, this issue isn't about the systemic racism. It's not about police brutality. It's not about the peaceful protesters, but it's about him beating this drum of law and order and trying to paint the peaceful protesters as mobs, trying to incite, in some ways, violence, invoke fears, and to create this narrative, particularly for those suburban voters who he's not polling very well with, that if he's not reelected, that their cities are going to be overrun by looters and people intent upon engaging in violent activity.
Right. He recently sent a message to suburban moms about, you better watch out, you're not safe in the suburbs. Do you think that he sees fear of unrest as his ticket to a second term?
Oh, absolutely. He made that very clear during the 4 days of that RNC convention that we watched. We watched speaker after speaker, talk about these mobs that are going to somehow invade the suburbs. And even before the convention, we saw him actually tweeting to suburban women, again, in this antiquated notion that somehow the suburbs look the way they did in 1950s, that there are all of these all-white housewives in the suburbs who are fearful of immigrants and fearful of African Americans and fearful of Latinx people. And he's so tone deaf. When you talk to people who live in the suburbs are so diverse. They have immigrants, they have African Americans. The women that live in the suburbs are educated. They're moms, and in my conversations with them, their biggest issue isn't some mythical mob that's going to invade their communities, but it's COVID-19, which has their kids home from school and which has, upended their entire lives. And he doesn't seem to get that the suburbs of the 2020 are not the suburbs of the 1950s.
Well, Trump and Pence say Biden wants to defund the police, but Biden has stated clearly he is not for that. Do you think Biden and Harris will be effective in debunking the Republicans' claim?
I think so, Natalie. Trump and Pence, and again, many of his surrogates repeatedly make that statement about the Biden-Harris ticket being in favor of the notion of defunding the police. Biden has said it over and over again that he is in favor of looking at the systemic racism that plagues police departments around this country. He's interested in looking at how to reform police departments, particularly those that have had an issue with police brutality. But he has made it very clear that he does not support any efforts to defund the police. And Trump keeps making that misstatement. It keeps getting repeated over and over again. But I think those voters who are listening are clear that that is not a premise of the platform for Biden and Harris.
Well, as President Trump warns of crime taking over streets of America under Biden, statistics show actually a surge in violent crime has occurred this year in several American cities that would be on President Trump's watch. The Chicago mayor has blamed guns coming in across state lines for it. How might Trump counter that?
You know, that's the irony, Natalie. He keeps talking about this America under Joe Biden, but the reality is the America that he's painting is happening on his watch. And he hasn't been effective in addressing the violence in the streets of Chicago. And in fact, his rhetoric is actually inciting the violence. He hasn't talked about the 17-year-old in Wisconsin who walked about brazenly with this automatic weapon and shot 3 people, killing 2 people. So I think this message that Donald Trump is trying to communicate is going to backfire. People are far more sophisticated. They see what's happening in the streets. They can distinguish between peaceful protesters and those that are intent upon engaging in violent conduct. And they can see that this world that he says is going to exist under Joe Biden is the world that Donald Trump is that we're living today, and he's the president of the United States.
We always appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for joining us, Areva Martin. Thank you, Areva.
Thank you, Natalie.